I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. Sherry, it's so great to see you. Last time we met, we were in some airport somewhere. We touched base for a couple minutes, and it's not surprising that the two of us would encounter each other in an airport at some point. And I've loved your work on coaching, but we have this new book, Intentional Instructional Moves. I want to move through this moving book about moves. But could you just, for the one or two people who maybe don't know you, say a little bit about how you got into coaching, your kind of the work you do, and so forth?
Sure. So, Sherry St. Clair, and you can find me online at Reflective Learning. But my first book, Coaching Redefined, I wrote for coaches and anyone in instructional leadership, so administrators and instructional coaches. And as I was working in schools with that book, the request I kept getting was, Sherry, we really need a guide for what effective instruction looks like. Can you help us put that together? And I tried that with several schools, Jim, and inevitably, when I would leave those schools, that work would fall apart because it was just too heavy, too much. You know that they don't. There's never enough time in a school, and so that was my clue to just, take a step back and reflect on that. And I thought, this is a way that I can truly serve schools and help with the field of coaching. And that's where Intentional Instructional Moves was birthed, and just the inspiration for that book. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to be here today and talk about that work. And I have the privilege of working with schools, as you know, throughout the country and beyond, and love, love, love all my work in instructional leadership.
I wanted to say that I really feel this is a complement to some of the work that we do. So I've got a book called High Impact Instruction, which is my book about instruction. And then we've written about instructional playbooks. And I feel that this book fits right in between those two things. You could use intentional instructional moves to add to high impact instruction. They did deal with some things differently. We have a different way of looking at it, but there's a lot of ways in which the two books complement each other. And then I think this book could be a support for people creating instructional playbooks. So I see it right in the middle of a lot of stuff that we do. That's why I'm so glad we get to have the conversation.
I agree with you completely, and I've been told by some of the coaches that I'm working with that they're using that to make their instructional playbook. So, yes, I think the work complements the work that you're doing, which I'm thrilled. That's what makes our field stronger.
It is. And this book is just jam-packed with stuff. I'm looking at the 18 chapters, all about everything from student discourse to growth mindset to student goal setting to student presentations. We're going to zone in on about 5 of those key things, just to give people a little flavor for what's here, so a sense of what's here, if that's okay. That's what I'm kind of thinking. And so I thought we should start where we're having this conversation near the end of the school year, but where a lot of people will be, when they hear this, they'll be thinking about next year. So one of your themes is classroom management. What do you say about classroom management in your book?
Okay, so let me back up just a moment from this, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I stole this idea from you, Jim, and I don't even think I had a chance to share this with you in our quick encounter at the airport. But I remember when I first started writing, I stole something from you that you had posted on Instagram because I thought it was a great idea. And you said, I start a book by making all these large posters that go around a room, and then I start putting topics and start brainstorming. And so that's what I did with Coaching Redefined. And that's also what I did with this book. And so what I did was I thought about, what is it that makes great, effective instruction? We have teachers who are leaving our profession because they are just, well, for various reasons. But one, they feel undersupported. They feel overwhelmed with time. They feel like it's undoable. And so I wanted to give them a resource that was just straight to the point of, here's what makes effective instruction, here's why this component is important, and then here's intentional steps to do this in the classroom. And I tried to weave into those things that are important beyond just state test scores. Things like the social emotional well-being of our students, things like preparing students for career force outside of school, and then just the science behind how today's students are learning. What does the most current research say? Help students retain content so that we don't have to go back and reteach and reteach and reteach, addressing that tier one. So, in every one of these chapters, those things are embedded, just high impact according to research strategies, embracing the social emotional learning component, and preparing students for the workforce. And then I mapped out that effective instruction. If we really walked into a classroom, what is it that we want to see? If we're an effective classroom teacher, what do we want to see in our classroom? And one of those beginning components, as you know, is classroom management. If we don't have that part in place, then some of the other components are much harder to put in place. So that's why you see that there is this chapter on classroom management. And yes, when many people listen to this, then they're going to be thinking summer, they're thinking about how do I set up that classroom? How do I make it so my students will respect the environment, but also respect me and come in, and how do I set those clear expectations for students?
So when you're dealing with classroom management, what are a couple tips you can give us about things that we should be thinking about?
Well, so one is definitely how do I provide clarity for my students? Sometimes, especially if students are in school longer, we expect them to know, how do you behave in school? What are your expectations for participating in classroom discussion? What does the teacher expect a student to do during group work, for example? But so during that classroom management piece, or at the beginning of the year, at that classroom management piece, we want to make sure we have a lot of clarity around our expectations of students in the classroom. And I would tell you that the closer those are in every classroom in our school, the more clarity students will have. If they don't have to jump from one teacher's expectations to another teacher's expectations, if we can have that collective efficacy part, that helps as well. But that clarity piece is one piece that I think teachers should keep in mind. And you know that I'm huge on relationships, both relationships of coaches with teachers and teachers with students. So, how do you build those strong relationships at the beginning of the year? Not just getting to know you as a person, because I want to know your personality and who you are, but also those learning styles and how you like to learn, what you like to learn about, so that I can weave that into my instruction.
So understanding your students, clear expectations, and then we would say in high impact instruction, positive reinforcement when you see it, corrections when you don't see it, fluent corrections. I see that as at the heart of classroom management: expectations, reinforcement, corrections. If we want kids to act a certain way and we ignore them when they do it, we shouldn't be surprised they don't do it. But if we give them their attention, we're going to get there. But classroom management is not engagement. So you have another chapter on engagement. Certainly classroom management, the purpose of it is for kids to be in learner-friendly environments where they can really learn. But how do you distinguish between classroom management and engagement? What are we talking about in your eyes when we talk about engagement?
Well, so this is another area where I think our work complements each other. But if you think about that classroom engagement piece, you're thinking about the cognitive, the behavioral, and emotional engagement piece.
Right.
So the better we know students, the better we can pull them into content emotionally. That's, that emotional engagement piece that we can bring in. Students just doing what we're asking, that's behavioral engagement, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're engaging in the content to retain the content. They're just doing what we're asking them to do. So the part that I think that we have to keep in mind is that cognitive engagement piece, and how are we bringing the students in to really think deeply about the work that we are putting in front of them? How do we keep them actively involved in that learning versus, just sitting there receiving information. That how are we helping them to process information and work on some of those social emotional skills of perseverance and self management of learning. All that flows into that cognitive engagement piece.
Yeah, Phil Schlexy talks about authentic engagement versus strategic compliance. I love that concept of strategic compliance. You have kids who look like they're learning, they're doing what they need to do, but the experience for them is they're like, their mind is maybe 10% engaged. They're thinking about other things. They're doing it because they don't want to get in trouble or they want to get a good grade, but the thing itself doesn't matter. When you've got that cognitive engagement, the kids are actually getting out of the activity what the teacher wants them to get out of it.
Right, and if you look at Patty's work on student boredom, if students are bored, it has an impact size of minus 0.49. So it makes it so much harder for the teacher to have students retain that content that they're trying to get them to teach if the students aren't interested in it. So we have to not only, in today's world, we can't just think about what is the standard that I have to teach, but we also have to think about how do we teach it so that we help students to remember it.
Such an interesting thing. So this is we're gonna get we're going off track already here, Sherry. Just so you know. But in his book Flourish, Martin Seligman talks about what's a flourishing life, and he has this acronym I'm sure you know called PERMA. And but just in case people don't know, PERMA stands for positive experiences. It stands for engagement. It stands for relationships and meaning and accomplishment. And a flourishing life is one where we have positive experiences, when we're engaged in what we do, where our relationships are healthy and life giving, and where we have meaning in what we do and we feel a sense of accomplishment. We're knocking things out and getting things done. So I did this thing for a long time where I would have my little PERMA acronym, and it was kind of a little reflection activity at the end of the day. On a scale of 1 to 10, how positive was today? How engaged was I? How about my relationships? And I started to see that there were things I was doing where my engagement level was really low. And I had to redefine how I'm doing it now too, trying to make sure I'm going to do my best work when I'm doing the things that are most engaging. So what you're talking about with kids is exactly what I found about as a human being. We have such a minimum amount of time. I don't want to spend too much of it on boring stuff. I want to focus on the stuff that's going to lead to more meaning and accomplishment, and it's going to have more of a positive impact. So I think it's not just about kids sitting down and being quiet. It's about lighting a fire in them so they really are passionate about what they're doing. They're learning in ways that's you can't always do that, but not everything in the class is going to be life-changing, passionate thing, but still to think about how can I make this less boring, more compelling, I think is really, really important.
Right. And, Jim, as adults, we can say, I don't like doing that. I'm going to either hire somebody to do that or eliminate that from my life, or I'm going to go a different direction with my business. But students can't do that. And
Right,
sometimes teachers can't do that.
right.
Sometimes this is the standard that you have to teach. And that's why in this book, with the intentional steps, I tried to give them several different strategies to
Mm.
implement this because if this thing doesn't work for you, then let's move to this thing. Let's have some options because yes, you might not have the opportunity to go down a different path with the standard, but if we have to teach that standard and we know it's one that students aren't necessarily interested in, how can we engage them and keep them engaged and interested in it so that it does begin to light that fire?
That's very, very cool. So then next thing you've got is assessment for learning. So I wanted to say something about this before we get into it, which is my mentor in so many ways, but in particular in terms of instruction. Well, actually, in particular, and about how to be a decent person is Don Deschler. And Don was, while he worked at the University of Kansas, he oversaw $500 million worth of research on instruction for kids with disabilities. And I love the guy. He's one of those people. Sometimes we're blessed to have two or three people that help us want to be a better person in our lives, and that you always know they're on your side. He was one of those people for me. I say was because he's now in Africa working in Ghana to help with kids in Ghana. So he's gone over there kind of on a mission to do good things. But I asked Don in a meeting once, Remember, he's done more work on instruction than anybody I know. I mean, John Hattie has done a lot too, and he's kind of a friend too. But I said, well, what would you do? If you're going to pick one thing to work on, what do you think would most be important? And he said, for kids to set goals and then monitor their progress towards the goals. He said, the most important thing in my mind, of any of the things we could do, would be to make sure kids know what they're trying to learn and that they're monitoring the progress, and the kids know how they're learning, and the teacher knows how they're learning. So that's my little introduction to assessment for learning. It's so fundamental and often not central. When the kids don't know where they are and the teacher doesn't know where the kids are, you have your assessments along the way, but for teachers to start to really get a grip on formative assessment and for kids to know their progress, really, really powerful. So what did you say about assessment for learning? What do you want to share about that?
And so, Jim, to add to that, we see in our field, we see research going in all different directions. And quite frankly, sometimes it doesn't align, and we have to dig deeper into why it doesn't align. But goal setting is one of those things that Marzano and Hattie have both identified as high impact strategies, have some great impact on student learning. So it is something I think that we need to keep in the forefront of our mind. And it's not just setting goals with students at the beginning of the year and revisiting them at Christmas. I mean, that just that doesn't work for any humans, more or less, young students or students in schools. It doesn't work for us as adults. So with this assessment for learning piece, this is an opportunity for teachers to give constant feedback to students and to help them know exactly where they are along the learning progression, so that they don't get to the end of a project or an end of a unit or chapter and then discover that they have all these misunderstandings, or that they don't do something 100 times the wrong way and get that in their mind as the correct way to do it, and then to find out that it's incorrect. So that assessment for learning piece is that teacher being a constant provider of information, questioning, feedback to make sure that all students are answering those questions, that they can see the visible learning of all students, to make sure that they are pulling all of those students along. It also helps the teacher know when to progress, to move forward, or when to come back. If a teacher is only or mainly looking at that assessment of learning piece, that assessment at the end of the unit or chapter, then they've missed a large portion of classroom time of knowing how to adapt their teaching. So it not only is beneficial to students, but it is highly beneficial to the teacher. But one thing that we sometimes have to work on in classrooms is we will design that assessment in a way that one or two students answer it instead of hearing from all students. So when we're thinking about that assessment piece, we not only want to think about how often am I asking questions, how often am I giving feedback, how often am I hearing from the students, but then we add that word all. How often am I allowing all students to answer questions? So that's where we get the whiteboards out and we see the answers of all students, or everybody's thumbs up, and we ask for feedback, or we do those turn-in talks and we listen to what they're saying to each other, versus just listening to the student that calls out first, or the person who's the loudest in the classroom, and allowing those students to be compliant in the background.
That's a big part of what we do. I mean, our way of looking at this, and I think what's great is I think we may have some nuts and bolts things that complement what you got here, just in terms of specifics. But we would say very important to ask yourself, and this is Julie Stern, and I did a podcast with her about 6 months ago. But are we worried about acquisition or transfer? If we're worried about transfer, it's a different kind of assessment. It's probably going to be more like a rubric. But if it's acquisition, then checks for understanding or a little quizzes and a selected response would work. So that's a key thing. And then are we measuring, this is an oversimplification, but are we measuring knowledge or skills? If we're measuring knowledge, it's going to be one kind of assessment. If it's skills, it's going to be another. And you're absolutely right to just find out 4 weeks later whether or not the kids learn. It's like my little analogy is it's like a GPS that just tells you when you're home, but doesn't tell you if we're on track or off track. We need to know if we have to recalculate here, and we need The kids need to know, the teacher needs to know. So I'm all in on assessment for learning. I think it's a really, really key piece.
It is a big piece, isn't it?
So then the next thing I've circled, and I'm not following your order at all, but the next thing I wanted to talk about is group work. Um, that giving kids a chance to learn from each other, to mediate their own learning, even just to break up the way your brain works. Because if you're just hearing lecture all the time or direct instruction all the time, it gets pretty boring. And we've already agreed that boredom isn't really the best learning environment. So tell me about what you said people should think about with respect to group work.
Well, for one, group work is not just putting students in groups. It is designing those activities so that students must work together for a common good to create a task or a product or answer a question. But it's not just, I'm going to sit in front of somebody and then do individual work. But the other thing that a teacher needs to think about is how do they strategically coach students in their classroom to take on more responsibility for that learning and to be active learners during group work. One thing that I find, Jim, in coaching schools, and like you, I have the opportunity to coach K through 12. And sometimes I see us doing group work the same way in second grade as I see in 10th grade, which tells me we're giving students experiences with group work, but we're not really teaching them the skills of taking over that leadership of that group work. We are going over the same rules. We have just that same methodology. And so when I'm thinking about those career skills that students need, that they need leadership and they need active learning and they need perseverance and flexibility, how are we teaching those skills during group work? Or do we just know that students learn best when they're building on the thoughts of the others and that classroom discussion is taking place and we're providing opportunities? That's good. I mean, it's much better than students working solely on their own all the time, but we also have to think about that piece of how we get them to take ownership and work through struggles and find their own answers, and build on each other's learning experience as well. Pull from each other and not just go to the teacher for every answer.
Yeah. And Um, there's so many reasons why there's good opportunities for kids to work in groups, not the least of which is that one person group moves another one forward. It takes it from just receiving to make it more active in terms of what they're doing. It breaks up what happens. And learning how to work in a group, of course, is a pretty fundamental life skill. And you're going to have to work in groups the rest of your life. If we can learn it here, we can apply it later on.
Yes, and I'm hearing from teachers that they now have to implement smaller groups than in years past, and that students don't really know how to talk to each other. They don't know how to work through conflict. And so teachers sometimes will shy away from group work because of that. And Jim, my thought on that is if these are skills that students don't have, we need to be doing more of them in schools and coaching the students to know how to work in groups, because you're right, it's a skill that they need for careers. The research is showing that they still need that for careers. But to say that in this day and age, students don't know how to do it, or they don't like it, or one student just does all the work and then to abandon that strategy because of that, we have to rethink that if that's how we are thinking about group work in our classrooms.
It's such a fundamental truth. Just because the strategy isn't working doesn't mean that the strategy is the problem. The problem could be the way we set up the strategy. And so just because something doesn't work, it's, well, maybe we need to stop and pause. I wonder if I need to set up the activity differently rather than just say, well, it didn't work because one kid did all the work. Just build in. And that's why I love your title, intentional. Being really intentional about what's the learning that's supposed to, or the experience kids are supposed to have, and then doing the moves that make it happen. So in group work, it's about being intentional about a positive group experience.
Yeah, so I know that we're not talking deeply about the coaching piece today, but coaches will sometimes say to me, "Well, this teacher said they don't do group work." I'm just using group work as an example. Group work because it doesn't work in their class. Their students can't work in groups well. And my response to that is that's exactly why we need to be doing it in schools then. We need to be doing things that students don't know how to do yet. We need to be giving them experiences, but using that word yet keeps them in that growth mindset. And then that's why in this book, I have mapped out those very intentional steps that a teacher can take to master that concept because um, we can't just go in and say you need to implement group work as a coach. That's way too broad and way too much for a teacher to sometimes think about or take on. But we can go in and say, have you thought about this one component of group work and then move to the next step with them?
Very, very cool. Okay. So one of your chapters is on direct instruction, and there's a lot of talk about direct instruction out there in the big world. It's almost ideological. Like you're a Catholic and I'm a like whatever your religion. It's very almost the conversations become very heated, like Northern Ireland or something a few decades ago. And it's a shame because I think when you spend a lot of time in classes and you're open minded about what happens, you realize that different instructional practices serve different purposes. What really matters is that kids are learning what they need to learn. And part of what they're learning is a love for learning, and they're learning to have self efficacy, you know? So it's not just engagement, it's not just achievement, but that combination. And so direct instruction, to my mind, really has a place in what happens, but not everything would be necessary. Depends on the teacher, depends on the class. Um, I probably don't want a constructivist class about how to repair the engine of a jet. If I'm getting on the jet, I'd like the person who fixes my plane to get some direct instruction. But tell me about your thoughts about direct instruction and why you included it and what you said.
So I included direct instruction because it is an important component of classroom instruction, effective in classroom instruction. And I think, Jim, in my coaching with coaches and teachers, I think it's probably the most misunderstood concept. So if we look at John Hattie's definition of direct instruction and we start breaking that down, it is not that traditional thought of sage on a stage, teacher dumping content into students' brains. Direct instruction, in a nutshell, is we are directing the pathway that students will gain the knowledge that they need of that standard. So it's more, I like to think of it more of the I do, we do, you do framework of teaching. It is, yes, there's that time where the teacher is showing students what they are going to be learning. They're setting up that clarity piece. They're going over the information, kind of like our traditional view of that direct instruction. But then there's also that piece where the teacher is asking the question and trying to get a formative assessment in place. And then they're releasing that to where they're showing some models of work to create clarity around that work, and then giving students opportunities to try something that goes along with that work, and then releasing students to some independent or group work related to it. So it's not just that I'm going to go over content with you, but it is, I have thought about my lesson and where I want my students to be at the end of the lesson. And I'm thinking very strategically about the direction this lesson will take to get them to that end point at the end of the lesson.
Right. And that should be actually highly engaging.
It should
And
be.
and it's integrating checks for understanding so kids know how they're doing. When I'm seeing direct instruction work effectively as a part of an overall lesson, the kids are excited because they can see themselves mastering what they're learning. Now, I think one of the key elements of learning, as Brian Goodwin describes it in the new classroom instruction that works, which is the new Marzano, is that sixth level of learning is extend and apply. And so it's not just sit and receive. You need to extend and apply and say, how do I use these skills in other places? I used to do really intense direct instruction around writing, and kids would had scaffolded learning where step by step they'd progress. And then I'd ask them to write a paragraph and they forgot everything I'd taught them with the direct instruction. So there needs to be extend and apply as a part of it. But to be clear, to be engaging kids, to have them monitoring the learning along the way, super, super powerful piece about teaching.
And it takes you're exactly right, and it takes a lot of forethought. And I
Right.
think that's sometimes, the hard part, because again, we're always struggling with that time piece, but it takes a lot of forethought to be able to think about how do I scaffold it up so that they're not doing. I don't know about you, but with like, I can use that writing example. Sometimes when you do that example of writing on the board, then the students turn around and do just exactly what you did. But as a teacher, you have to think about now, how do I scaffold that lesson so that they don't do exactly what I did, but they're using some of those skills and building on that.
My friend Ed Ellis is a real leader in the world of direct instruction, and I don't know if he'd call it direct instruction, but effective instruction. And he and Anita Archer talked about the gradual release model that Fisher and Fry talk about. Anita and Ed and others talked about. I mean, that concept of I do it, we do it, you do it's been around for a long time. But Ed's from Alabama. He's a Roll Tide guy. He works at the University of Alabama. And his thing was, I do it, we do it, y'all do it, you do it. That's how he did it. And the y'all do it was where kids practice together before they do it independently. So there's a lot to be said. I love the intentional thing. Now, one last piece I want to talk about is differentiation. You have a chapter on differentiation. So I'd love to hear about that. And that's been a big focus for my thinking recently because I've been working a lot with my friend Carol Tomlinson about what's it look like to differentiate. And it has been wonderful to work with her. And at the same time, it's challenging to hold all those ideas together and translate them into practice, which is the heart of the matter of what she and I have been talking about. But tell me about differentiation, why you think it's important. Maybe that's just obvious, but why it's important and what can we do to differentiate more effectively?
Well, first, I think Carol Ann is a jewel to our field. I mean, her work has just been so influential in so many different ways.
And
But
she's I have had the chance to work with her a lot over the fact I met with her this week. And sorry to interrupt, but I just don't want to let her to go without, she is a gem, as you said. She is such a good person. It's just every conversation I have with her is kind of life giving. I had to do a podcast with her a while back on this program. But anyway, go ahead.
well, there are those individuals in our field who just want to make the field better, and I think that she's one of them. And I'm grateful for her work too. But I think you're right in that when teachers think about differentiation, this is another concept that can be overwhelming to them because it is like, okay, I have 29 students in my classroom. How do I differentiate for 29 different ways? And are you saying I have to create 29 different lessons for all of those students? And that's not necessarily the case. If I'm working with differentiation in a classroom, we try to start out small because it can be a daunting task. Now, when a teacher really masters it, they love it because their students are more engaged, they are more interested, and quite frankly, the grading is more interesting to teachers as well. But if you are just starting to dip your toes into differentiation, I would say start small. You can start with maybe I'm differentiating just content for those small groups that I'm doing. Maybe I'm differentiating that process. Maybe I'm giving them an option of the product that they're creating. And again, sometimes when we do the product, we will do, choice boards, but a teacher doesn't have to put 50 choices on that for students. I always encourage teachers, stay in control of that end point. That goes back to that direction. Where are you wanting to take students, and stay in control of that if you're working in differentiation. And the last one is the environment. They might have them working individually or working in small groups, then they can differentiate that way as well. But start small and get comfortable with that concept of differentiation before you move into larger pieces of differentiation, I guess.
One of my favorite concepts is the concept of hope. And hope has this idea of something to hope for. I have a goal. So my friend Christian and I are going on this big hike in November, and
Oh,
so I'm
nice.
hoping that I can get in shape so I can actually do the hope walk about 10 miles a day or something. So something to hope for, and then a pathway to the goal, and then belief that the pathway will take you there, or multiple pathways. And this is the work of Shane Lopez and Rick Snyder and others. Um, and so what I like about your book is I think it gives people hope because it gives them pathways. They say, well, I need to differentiate. Well, here's some ideas. I need to work on direct instruction. I need to work on group work. I need to get my kids doing goal setting. But there are a lot of pathways in the book. So I'm wondering, as people look through your book, where do you think they start? Should they just work through it chapter by chapter, or what's the best way for me as a coach, maybe me as a teacher first, or as a coach, if I read the book, how should I use the book?
Okay, so the answers that may be slightly different, but I've written the book in a way that no, you don't have to start at the beginning and read this book to the end. It is truly, my hope truly is, Jim, that this saves teachers time, number one, and that they can go straight to that and know that it's strong research based because I put a ton of research into this book. But how so each chapter just goes over that concept. And then at the end of each chapter, so the chapter on classroom management, there will be intentional steps to implement that concept. And what a teacher can do is read that and reflect and think, what are my students showing me? Where are they? Do they need this intentional step? One, two, three, four. And honestly, the intentional steps are not written in any way that research says you have to do one before two, before three, before four. The intentional steps are written based on my work in classrooms with so many teachers and coaches and saying, this is what has worked most often in this order. But that's not to say, your classroom is the same. So you pick one of those intentional steps and then you go to the virtual companion guide that I've released to go with this. And in that companion guide on that intentional step, there will be several strategies that a teacher can choose to implement. And then they just choose that. The handouts are there with them. There's over 50 handouts that go with this book. I've really tried to make it to where it's a benefit for teachers to take it and use it and go to it and save some time looking for tools and strategies. Now, for coaches, the way that I'm encouraging coaches to use this is hopefully they have a goal set with their teacher that they're working with. And if they have that goal set as they're going in the classroom and they're watching that instruction or they're talking to that teacher about what's happening in the classroom, then they can also reflect on those intentional steps. So if the teacher's working on classroom management, then they're going to look at those intentional steps and say, here's where the students are struggling, and then pull some of those strategies from the companion guide and let the teacher choose, which strategy might work for them, but give the teacher options. So they can use that in book studies, they can use it in their coaching, but that's the way that I hope the coaches can use this information.
Well, it's great. And then, of course, it can be resource text for creating an instructional playbook too. So that makes ton of sense.
Like, absolutely. And I hope it is. That's my hope.
I love it, and I'm so grateful for it. I'm so grateful for you, Sherry. It's been uh, what's the right word? It's been exciting to have this conversation because I do see how much hope you could bring to teachers by coaches and teachers by giving them the tools to move forward, to move, and that's the title, intentional instructional moves. So thank you so much, Sherry.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for opportunity. And it's always great to collaborate with you.
We have to keep it going. All right, take care.